Four friends, John, Emily, Mike, and Sarah, set off for a weekend picnic in a remote, isolated forest. The peaceful setting of a secluded lake surrounded by tall, dark trees seemed like the perfect escape from their hectic lives. They had heard whispers about strange occurrences in the area, but dismissed them as mere legends. Little did they know, the forest held a dark secret, one that would soon turn their dream getaway into a nightmare they would never forget. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest came alive with eerie sounds, and shadows seemed to move with a mind of their own. The tranquil lake, once a picture of serenity, now seemed to hold something sinister beneath its calm surface. What started as a simple picnic soon became a race for survival, as the friends realized they were not alone. Something was watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike. This is the terrifying tale of the creepy picnic. The gathering. It was supposed to be the perfect escape. A quiet weekend getaway in the woods, far away from the city lights, far away from the noise. Emma, Mark, Jason, and Sophie were friends from college who had stayed in touch over the years. They had always talked about getting away, about hiking through the woods, having a picnic in the wilderness, and escaping the stresses of everyday life. After months of planning, the day had finally arrived. They met early in the morning, packing their bags with food, drinks, and camping gear. Emma's excitement was palpable, but Mark, ever the realist, had a strange look in his eyes. He had heard rumors about the forest they were visiting, that it had a dark history, that some people had gone missing, and others had never returned. But Mark kept those thoughts to himself. It was just an old forest, right? Emma, I can't believe we're finally doing this. A whole weekend away from everything. Mark, yeah, just us nature and, well, whatever is out there. Jason, quit worrying. It'll be fun. What's the worst that could happen? Sophie, I love how peaceful it looks already. This is going to be amazing. The drive was long, and the closer they got to their destination, the quieter the world seemed to become. The landscape shifted from the familiar sight of city buildings to dense forests and narrow, winding roads. The air grew cooler, and the trees began to tower over the car, casting deep shadows on the road. A sense of unease slowly crept over the group. The moment they arrived, a cold wind greeted them, sending chills down their spines. But they shrugged it off, eager to explore. They parked near a small clearing, deep within the forest. No other cars were visible. The area was eerily silent. Sophie, I don't know, the place looks a little too quiet. Do you think anyone else is here? Emma, maybe it's just too early. We'll see more people later. Mark, if not, even better. The less crowded, the better. Jason, all right, let's get going. We don't have all day. As they made their way to the picnic spot, the trees seemed to grow thicker, their branches intertwined like twisted fingers. The sun was beginning to dip behind the horizon, casting long shadows across the ground. Emma felt a strange prickle on the back of her neck, but she ignored it. They were there to have fun, not to overthink things. The fire and shadows. By the time they found a good spot to set up their picnic, the sky had turned dark. Jason built a fire, and they gathered around it, laughing, chatting, and feeling the warmth of the flames. It was supposed to be a night of fun, but the deeper they ventured into the night, the more restless the atmosphere became. Emma, I didn't expect it to get so cold. It feels like the temperature dropped 10 degrees in a matter of minutes. Sophie, I know, right? It's giving me the creeps. What's going on with the trees? They're making these weird noises. Mark, it's just the wind. Calm down, Sophie. But Sophie wasn't convinced. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The sounds around them were strange. The wind wasn't just rustling the leaves. It was moaning, as if something was moving just outside their view. Jason, maybe it's just the forest. Let's not make it worse by freaking out. Sophie, yeah, but listen, did you hear that? Emma, what? That's just the wind. Come on, it's a forest. Let's have fun. But as she spoke, something moved in the distance. Something that wasn't the wind. The first glimpse. Suddenly, a figure appeared between the trees. At first, it was just a shadow, tall and slender, standing still. It wasn't human, yet it seemed to watch them. The firelight flickered as if reacting to the figure's presence. The air around them grew even colder, and the warmth from the fire no longer felt comforting. Emma, what is that? Mark, I don't know, it looks like someone standing there. Jason, probably just another camper. Let's not make a big deal out of it. But they were wrong. It wasn't a camper. As they stared, the figure didn't move. It didn't speak. It just stood there in the shadows watching them. Sophie grabbed Emma's arm. Sophie, I have a bad feeling about this. We need to go. Now. Mark, relax. It's probably just someone lost. I'll go check it out. Mark stood up and walked toward the figure, but the closer he got, the further away it seemed to drift into the trees. He called out, but there was no response. He stood in the empty woods for a moment, his breath visible in the cold air. Suddenly, the figure vanished. Mark rushed back to the group, his face pale. Mark, guys, we're not alone out here. The whispering winds. The atmosphere turned darker as Mark rejoined the group. The wind began to pick up, rustling the leaves with an unnatural force. It wasn't the peaceful sound they'd heard before. It was more like a whisper, low, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from all directions. Emma, did you hear that? Sophie. Oh my God, what is that? Jason. It's just the wind. Stop being paranoid. But Jason's words fell flat. Even he could hear it now, soft whispers, faint but clear, as though someone was speaking just beyond the firelight. The fire flickered again, casting eerie shadows over their faces. Suddenly, the whispers turned into distinct words. Voice in the wind. Leave now. The voice was faint, almost drowned out by the wind, but it was unmistakable. They all froze, their eyes wide with terror. Emma, that wasn't the wind. That was a voice. Mark, we need to go. Now. But before they could move, the ground beneath their feet began to tremble. The earth rumbled, low and menacing. The wind howled, and the trees seemed to sway violently, as if something enormous was moving through the forest. The fire they had built sputtered and died, casting them into complete darkness. The final moment. And then they saw it. The figure appeared again, only now it wasn't alone. There were more, too many to count, emerging from the shadows, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. The figures were tall, their limbs unnaturally long, and their faces twisted in grotesque expressions. They began to move toward the group, slowly at first, then with increasing speed. Sophie, we need to run. Now! They turned and sprinted toward the car, their footsteps echoing in the silent woods. But the figures followed, faster than humanly possible. They could hear them, the sound of branches snapping, feet thundering behind them. Just as they reached the clearing where the car was parked, the figures vanished, melting into the shadows. They didn't know if it was real or if they had just imagined it, but the terror was undeniable. They jumped into the car, slammed the doors shut, and drove off without looking back. But the terror didn't end there. As they drove through the darkened forest road, they could feel it. Something was still following them, lurking in the trees. The figures were out there, and they weren't alone. The unseen force. The car sped down the winding forest road, tires screeching as it tore through the darkness. Emma's hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, her heart pounding in her chest. Mark sat next to her, staring out the window, his face pale, his breath shallow. Emma, what the hell was that? Was that real? Mark, I don't know. I don't know. It felt too real, Emma. Too real. Jason, it couldn't have been real. We were just freaked out by the dark and the cold. Sophie, Jason, stop. You heard the whispers too. This isn't normal. Something was there with us. They all fell silent, the only sound the hum of the car's engine and the occasional rattle of the trees outside as they rushed past. The darkness outside seemed alive, a thick, suffocating presence pressing against the windows. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. They were nearly halfway back to the nearest town when Emma's headlights flickered and dimmed, casting the world around them into even darker shadows. The car stuttered as if struggling to stay on the road. Emma, what the hell now? Not now, not after everything. She stepped on the gas pedal, but the engine sputtered. The headlights flickered again and then went out entirely, plunging them into complete darkness. Mark, stop the car. We have to check it out. Emma, are you serious? It's pitch black outside. We need to get out of here. Jason, Emma, calm down. We have no choice. We'll just check under the hood and get back on the road. Reluctantly, Emma pulled over, and they all climbed out of the car, their breath fogging up in the cold night air. The forest around them felt oppressive, as if it were watching their every move. The trees loomed tall and silent, blocking out most of the stars. Only the faintest sliver of moonlight filtered through the branches, barely enough to see by. Sophie, I don't like this. I really don't like this. Mark, we'll be fine. Just stay close. Jason opened the hood, and the rest of them gathered around, their eyes darting nervously around the trees. The wind had picked up again, howling in strange, eerie gusts that made the trees creak and moan. Something didn't feel right. As they waited in silence, the shadows between the trees shifted. At first, it was just a flicker of movement, like the brush of a hand against the bark or a figure moving quickly in the distance. Then it was more than that. The figure appeared again. This time, it was much closer. Sophie screamed. "Sophie, it's here again. It's coming closer." They all turned to see a shadowy figure standing just beyond the car's headlights. Its eyes glowed faintly, like embers, and its limbs were long and twisted. The figure was humanoid in shape, but the proportions were all wrong. Its face, if it could even be called that, was a featureless, gaping void, and it seemed to be moving toward them slowly, deliberately. "Emma, get back in the car. Now!" They scrambled to get back inside, fear gripping their hearts like icy chains. Jason slammed the hood shut and dove into the passenger seat. Mark and Sophie piled into the back, all of them gasping for breath. Emma started the car, but the engine didn't turn over. "Mark, come on, start." "Jason, it's no use. We're stuck." The figure was closer now. It was almost at the edge of the headlights. It stood perfectly still, watching them, its eyes glowing brighter, as if feeding off their fear. "Sophie, we need to go. Now. Just leave the car." But Emma, her fingers trembling, tried again. This time, the engine roared to life. The car jolted forward, the tires screeching against the asphalt as they sped away, but the figure didn't chase them. Instead, it stood there, watching them drive off, its form dissolving back into the shadows. They didn't stop until they reached the nearest gas station. It was a small, rundown place, with flickering lights and a rusty sign that read, "Open 24 hours." The place felt deserted, except for a lone gas station attendant who was too busy watching TV to pay attention to them. "Emma, what the hell just happened? Was that real? Am I losing my mind?" "Mark, it was real, Emma. We all saw it. But we need to get help. We need to leave this place. Now." They filled the car with gas as quickly as they could, and Emma drove off without a second thought. But even as they left the station, the terror still gripped them. It wasn't over. They knew it wasn't over. The haunting truth. As they continued their drive, the road ahead seemed endless. They had hoped the further they drove, the more distant the horrors would become. But that wasn't the case. The feeling of being followed, of being watched, never left them. And then it happened. Just when they thought they were finally free, the car began to slow down. The headlights flickered again, and the engine sputtered. Emma pulled over to the side of the road in frustration. "Emma, not again. Not now." But as she stepped out of the car, a chill ran down her spine. The world around them had gone eerily silent. There were no more sounds of the wind, no birds, no rustling of leaves. Everything was still. And then they heard it. A whisper coming from the trees. Voice in the wind. "You cannot escape." The voice was low, guttural, and unmistakable. It wasn't just the wind. It wasn't just in their heads. The words seemed to come from every direction at once. "Jason, we're not alone. We need to leave now." But it was already too late. The ground beneath them rumbled again, and the trees began to sway violently. The forest seemed alive with malice, as if the very earth was turning against them. And then, from the shadows, more figures appeared. More than they had ever seen. They were everywhere, surrounding them, closing in. Their eyes glowed brightly, their shapes shifting in and out of view like ghosts. "Mark, get back in the car. Run!" But it was too late. The figures were upon them. One by one, they were dragged out of the car, pulled into the dark, their screams lost in the wind. The figures didn't stop. They never stopped. They fed on fear. They thrived on it. The wind howled louder now, a shrieking, furious beast that tore through the trees, bending them with unnatural force. The shadows swirled like dark tendrils around them, each one a threat that they could feel but not see. As the figures closed in, Emma, Mark, Jason, and Sophie were paralyzed by fear. It wasn't just the sight of the grotesque shapes that haunted them. It was the feeling of being utterly trapped, as if the world itself had turned against them. Emma's heart hammered in her chest, every beat seeming to echo in her skull. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she turned to her friends, her voice barely a whisper. "Emma, we need to run. Now!" But as she took a step towards the car, something reached out from the darkness. A cold, clammy hand gripped her ankle, pulling her down with terrifying strength. Emma screamed, a sound that was immediately swallowed by the wind. Her fingers clawed at the ground, but it was useless. The darkness had a hold on her, an iron grip that wouldn't let go. Mark! Emma! No! But Mark was already being pulled into the blackness as well. Sophie's screams echoed through the night as she was dragged back, her hands scrabbling against the dirt as she fought to break free. Jason, we can't stay here. We need to fight back. But the figures were too many. They were everywhere now, their eyes burning with malevolent fire. One by one, the four friends were torn apart, their bodies pulled away from the car, their screams mingling with the wind as they were consumed by the darkness. It wasn't just a physical force, it was something worse. The figures fed on their fear, feeding on the terror that clung to their souls, growing stronger with each passing moment. Emma's last thought, as she was dragged into the abyss, was that this was no ordinary night. It wasn't just a haunting. It was something far worse, something ancient, something hungry. And then everything went silent. The darkness consumes. It wasn't clear how much time had passed when Emma awoke, her body aching and bruised. The world around her was utterly still, the oppressive silence broken only by the faint rustling of leaves. She blinked, trying to clear the fog in her mind, but the moment her eyes opened, the memories rushed back in full force. The figures, the terror, her friends. She looked around frantically, but there was no sign of them. No sign of the figures either. She was alone. But Emma knew she wasn't alone. She could feel it. The air was thick with an unseen presence, watching her, waiting. Emma scrambled to her feet, her head spinning. The forest around her was dark, too dark, as if the very trees were closing in. Every step she took felt heavier, as though the earth beneath her feet was pulling her back, dragging her into the depths. Then from the shadows, a voice whispered her name. Voice, Emma. The voice was smooth and cold, like ice running down her spine. She spun around but saw nothing. Voice, you can't escape. You're ours now. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she stumbled backward. Her eyes darted around, searching for any sign of movement, but the forest was empty. The voice, however, was everywhere. It seemed to come from the ground beneath her, from the trees, from the very air around her. And then she saw it. A figure, barely visible in the shadows, standing motionless between the trees. Its eyes gleamed like embers in the dark, watching her with a cold, calculating gaze. It was tall, unnaturally so, its body bent at strange angles that didn't seem human. The shape flickered in and out of sight, as though it was made of smoke and shadows. Emma, who are you? What do you want? The figure didn't answer. Instead, it took a slow, deliberate step forward, its eyes never leaving hers. The ground beneath Emma's feet seemed to pulse with an eerie energy, and the trees around her groaned, as though the entire forest was alive, aware of her presence. Voice, you are lost, Emma. This is where you belong. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she backed away, her mind racing for a way out. She tried to turn to run, but the figure's voice stopped her in her tracks. Voice, you cannot run. You can never run from what you have awakened. The forest seemed to close in around her, the darkness suffocating, pressing against her chest. She could feel the eyes of the figure on her, its presence weighing down on her like 1,000 pounds. Emma couldn't breathe, couldn't think. She was paralyzed by the fear that clutched at her heart. And then, without warning, the figure moved. It moved with terrifying speed, its limbs stretching unnaturally long, its body contorting as it advanced on her. Emma, no! She screamed, but the sound was lost in the wind. She turned to flee, but the forest seemed to shift, the trees bending in her path. Every step she took felt like a battle, the ground beneath her feet seeming to pull her back. The figure was close now, so close that she could feel the cold, suffocating air that surrounded it. Its mouth opened, revealing rows of sharp teeth, like those of a predator ready to strike. Emma, no! Please no! But there was no escape. The figure lunged at her, its cold hand wrapping around her throat, tightening like a vice. She gasped for air, her vision fading as the darkness consumed her. And then everything went black. The forsaken road. As the darkness closed in around them, Emma's mind raced. The sinister whispers in the wind had never stopped. It felt as though they were being hunted, prey to an unseen force that had been lurking just beyond the edge of their vision. With every mile they drove, the air grew colder, heavier, like a weight pressing on their chest. Emma glanced over at Mark, who had been silent since the figures dragged them from the car. His face was ashen, eyes wide, filled with fear. Mark, Emma, we shouldn't have come here. This place, it's cursed. We shouldn't be here. Emma, I know, Mark. But we have no choice. We have to get out. We can't keep running forever. Sophie, sitting in the back seat, spoke up, her voice shaky. Sophie, there has to be something we can do. We can't just give up. Not like this. Jason, who had been brooding quietly in the front seat, suddenly turned to face them. His expression was dark, but his voice was filled with an eerie calm. Jason, there's only one way out of this, but it's risky. We need to face whatever's haunting us. We need to find the source. The problem is, we don't know what it is or where it's hiding. Emma, how do you know that? What do you mean, find the source? Jason, I've been studying the legends. This isn't just a random haunting. It's something older, darker. It's a force that feeds on fear. If we don't stop it, it will never stop coming for us. Mark, how do we stop it then? What do we do? Jason took a deep breath, looking out into the endless night. Jason, I don't know yet. But there's one thing I'm sure of. We need to go back to where it all started. We need to go to the place where this curse was born. Emma turned the wheel, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the weight of their fate settling on her shoulders. The forest around them had become a living, breathing entity, alive with malevolent energy. The trees seemed to bend inwards, casting dark shadows that flickered and swayed, like something was watching them from every angle. Sophie, I don't want to go back there. It's too dangerous. Emma, I know, Sophie. But we have no choice. If we don't stop this, it will follow us forever. We can't keep running. They were nearing the forest again, the road twisting and winding like a snake through the trees. The eerie quiet of the place was oppressive, and the closer they got, the more Emma felt that unseen presence, the one that had been stalking them from the moment they stepped into the forest. It was like a living nightmare, constantly lurking just beyond the edge of her vision. The headlights of the car flickered again, casting long, stretching shadows across the road. The car sputtered, and Emma slammed her foot on the gas pedal, trying to push forward. But the engine stalled once more. Emma, not again. Come on, start. Jason cursed under his breath. Jason, this is it. The forest is fighting back. We're trapped. Suddenly, the trees seemed to come alive, their branches creaking and groaning as they twisted and contorted into unnatural shapes. From the darkness, a figure emerged. Tall, thin, and twisted, its limbs stretching and contorting in impossible angles. The figure's eyes were black holes, empty and endless, and its face was a grotesque, distorted mask. Sophie screamed, pressing herself back into her seat, trying to shrink away from the horror that was unfolding in front of them. Sophie, it's here. It's here again. Emma slammed her hand on the horn, but it barely made a sound. The figure was getting closer, its movement unnatural, like it was gliding across the ground. The air around them felt thick with fear, suffocating. Jason, it's too late. We're not going to make it. But Emma wouldn't give up. She turned the key again, praying for the engine to roar to life. And this time it did. With a screech of tires, the car jerked forward, narrowly missing the shadowy figure that reached out with elongated hands. Emma pressed her foot down harder on the gas, the car speeding down the road. But the figure wasn't giving up. It was following them, always just behind, never far enough to escape. The car tore through the night, twisting and turning, until Emma spotted a small clearing up ahead, a patch of open land with a dilapidated cabin in the center. Emma, there! The cabin! We can take shelter there. They drove toward it, the figure still hot on their tail. The headlights illuminated the cabin in the distance, and just as they reached the entrance, the car lurched to a halt. Emma, get out! Hurry! They scrambled out of the car, fear coursing through their veins. The moment they stepped onto the ground, the air shifted. The whispering voices surrounded them, louder now, swirling around them, like the wind itself was alive and mocking them. Sophie, what is that? What's happening? Suddenly, the door to the cabin creaked open, and a figure stepped out of the darkness. It was a man tall, with sharp features and a stern expression. His clothes were old, ragged, and his eyes glowed faintly with an unnatural light. Man, you shouldn't have come here. Now you're part of the curse, and you will never leave. The unholy curse. The man's presence was overwhelming, his eyes cold and unyielding. Emma felt the weight of his words settle over her, as if the very air had thickened. The whispering voices around them grew louder, more frantic, as if the trees themselves were warning them to leave. But there was nowhere to go. The forest had surrounded them, and the cabin, now seemingly alive with darkness, stood as the only refuge. Emma, who are you? What is this place? The man didn't answer immediately. His gaze shifted to the trees, and for a moment, it seemed as if he was listening to the whispering voices, his expression unreadable. He then turned back to them, his lips curling into a grim smile. Man, I am the keeper of this place, the guardian of the curse. You should never have ventured this far into the forest. Mark, what curse? What are you talking about? We're just trying to survive. We didn't come here willingly. The man's smile faded and his face hardened. He took a step toward them, his presence causing the ground to tremble slightly beneath their feet. Man, the curse you are trapped in has been here for centuries. It feeds on fear, on the terror of those who trespass. And now, you are its latest victims. Sophie, her voice trembling with desperation, spoke up. Sophie, how do we stop it? How do we get out of here? The man's eyes glowed even brighter now, his gaze piercing through them as if he could see their very souls. Man, the curse cannot be undone. It cannot be escaped. The only way to free yourselves is to face it. Face the fear that has bound you here. Jason, ever the skeptic, stepped forward, his voice sharp and defiant. Jason, face it? How? What does that even mean? The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he pointed to the cabin behind him. Man, inside you will find what you seek. But be warned, the truth you discover will change you. It will test your very will to survive. Emma felt a cold shiver run down her spine. The cabin, once just a dilapidated structure in the distance, now felt like a prison, a place where answers would come at a terrible cost. Emma, we don't have a choice. We have to go in. Reluctantly, the group walked toward the cabin, their steps heavy, their hearts racing. As they reached the door, it creaked open of its own accord, the sound echoing into the night like a warning. The inside of the cabin was dark, save for the faint glow coming from an ancient, dusty lamp in the corner. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of decay and old wood. Inside, the room was sparse except for a large, weathered mirror on the far wall. It stood there, an imposing figure in the center of the room, reflecting nothing but darkness. The surface was cracked, the glass marred by deep fissures that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. Mark, what the hell is this? This isn't real. Emma stepped closer to the mirror, her reflection twisted in the shattered glass. As she peered deeper, she felt a strange pull, an overwhelming sense of dread washing over her. Jason, Emma, don't look into it. But it was too late. As Emma stared into the depths of the mirror, a voice spoke to her, soft but unmistakable. Voice in the mirror. You are not who you think you are. Emma gasped, stumbling backward. The mirror seemed to ripple, like water disturbed by a stone. Her reflection blurred, and a figure emerged from the depths of the mirror. It was her. Well, it looked like her, but twisted, a grotesque version of herself, with hollow eyes and a twisted, mocking grin. Sophie, Emma, what's happening? What is that thing? Emma's breath caught in her throat as the figure in the mirror reached out, its fingers stretching toward her. The air around them grew colder, and the whispers intensified, louder and more frantic than ever before. The figure in the mirror spoke again, its voice now distorted, echoing in Emma's mind. Voice in the mirror. You cannot escape. You cannot run from what you have become. Suddenly, the mirror shattered with a deafening crack, and the room was plunged into darkness. The group screamed, disoriented, as the floor beneath them seemed to shift and buckle. The walls seemed to close in, as if the very cabin was alive, squeezing them in its grip. Mark, what the hell is happening? We need to get out. Now! They stumbled toward the door, but as they reached it, the figure from the mirror appeared in the doorway, blocking their escape. It was no longer confined to the glass. It stood before them, tall and menacing, its body flickering like smoke. The figure's face was a distorted version of Emma's, its eyes hollow, its expression twisted into an evil grin. Sophie screamed, Emma, please, do something. Emma stood frozen, staring at the figure, her mind racing. She could hear the whispers in her head, mocking her, urging her to give in to the fear. Voice in the mirror. You are part of the curse now. You will never be free. The figure's hands reached toward her, and as it did, Emma felt a searing pain in her chest, as if her very soul was being pulled away. She fell to her knees, gasping for air, unable to break free from the grip of fear that was consuming her. Mark, Emma, get up. We have to leave. But Emma couldn't move. She was trapped in the vision, her mind lost in the terror that the figure had created. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure disappeared. The cabin fell silent. The whispers stopped. The door to the cabin slammed open, and they rushed outside, breathing heavily, looking around at the stillness of the forest. But they knew they weren't safe. The curse had claimed them. There was no escaping it now. Jason, his face pale and shaking, spoke with quiet dread. Jason, it's not over. It's never over. The final choice. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the forest as the group stood outside the cabin. They were all breathing heavily, their hearts pounding in their chests, but the silence around them was deafening. It felt as if the world had frozen, as if the forest itself was waiting for something to happen. Emma, still shaken by what she had seen in the mirror, was the first to speak, her voice barely a whisper. Emma, it's not real, right? That thing. Mark, his face pale, shook his head, cutting her off. Mark, it felt real. Too real. I don't know what's happening here, but I don't think we can outrun it. Sophie clutched her arms tightly around her body, her eyes wide with fear. Sophie, we can't just stand here. We need to get out of the forest. Now, before whatever it is comes for us again. Jason, always the one to try and reason through things, looked around, scanning the dark woods as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows. Jason, but where do we go? We've been running for hours, and it's like we're stuck in some sort of loop. Every path leads us back to this place. There's no escaping it. The air was thick with an unnatural chill, and Emma could feel the weight of the curse pressing down on her. The forest, once so serene, now felt like a vast, endless maze closing in around them. The sense of being watched, of being hunted, was overwhelming. The whispers had returned, more frantic than before, swirling around them like a swarm of bees. Mark, this isn't just about getting away, is it? This is about facing whatever is here, whatever is in this place. We can't escape it if we don't understand it. Emma's eyes widened in realization. Emma, the man, he said we have to face it. Face the fear. Sophie's voice shook as she spoke. Sophie, face it? What does that even mean? We've already seen what's in the mirror. We've already faced it. I don't think I can go through that again. Jason placed a hand on her shoulder, his expression serious but kind. Jason, I know. But I think Emma's right. If we don't confront whatever this is, we'll never escape. We have to understand what's happening here, why it's happening. We have to stop the curse, or it will never let us go. Mark looked around at the others, his gaze intense. Mark, and how exactly are we supposed to do that? What's left to face? Emma's mind raced as she tried to piece together the fragmented memories of what they had experienced. The figure in the mirror, the whispers, the man's cryptic words. There was something they were missing, something they had yet to understand. Emma, there's something about the mirror. I don't think it was just showing us our fears. I think it was showing us our truth. The others looked at her, confused. Emma, the figure, it wasn't just a reflection of me. It was showing me things I've been running from, things I've buried deep inside myself. I think that's the curse. It's not just about what's in the forest or the mirror. It's about what we've been hiding from ourselves. Sophie frowned, struggling to understand. Sophie, so you're saying that the curse is us? Emma nodded slowly, feeling the weight of her own words. Emma, yes. It's not about fighting the forest or the mirror. It's about confronting the things we've ignored, the fears and guilt we've buried. Mark stepped forward, his expression resolute. Mark, all right then. If this is about facing ourselves, let's do it. Let's face whatever's in here, and maybe we'll find the way out. The group stood in silence, the weight of their situation pressing heavily on them. But there was no turning back now. They had come this far, and there was only one way to end this, by confronting the curse head-on. They turned back toward the cabin, its dark form looming behind them, a silent sentinel waiting. The door creaked open as they approached, but this time, it didn't seem so inviting. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening, and the oppressive feeling in the air grew stronger with every step. As they crossed the threshold, the temperature dropped even further, and the faint glow from the lamp seemed to flicker in response to their presence. The mirror stood before them, its cracks pulsing with an unnatural light. This time, it didn't just reflect their images. It seemed to reach out to them, calling them to look deeper. Emma felt a cold shiver run down her spine as she approached it. She had to face it, face herself. She stepped closer to the mirror, her reflection wavering before her. The figure reappeared, its eyes locked onto hers. Voice in the mirror. You cannot run from the truth. It is who you are. The words echoed in her mind, and the room seemed to close in around her. She reached out, her hand trembling as it neared the surface of the glass. The moment her fingers touched it, a rush of memories flooded her mind. Memories of guilt, pain, and regret. Sophie gasped as she saw Emma's reflection change, morphing into a twisted version of herself, one filled with anger and sorrow. Sophie, Emma, don't please. But Emma couldn't pull away. The reflection in the mirror held her captive, its gaze locking her in place as the truth of her own darkness consumed her. Voice in the mirror. You are what you fear. The words seemed to echo through her entire being, tearing at the walls she had built around herself. She had been running from her own demons, from the guilt she had buried deep inside, and now it was all coming to light. She couldn't escape anymore. As the figure in the mirror reached out for her, the room seemed to shatter, the very fabric of reality bending around them. The group cried out, but the mirror's hold was unrelenting. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, everything stopped. The whispers, the fear, the vision. Everything fell silent. The mirror cracked and shattered, its shards falling to the floor with a deafening crash. The darkness in the room lifted, and the group stood breathless in the calm after the storm. But Emma knew the truth now. She had faced the curse, faced her own fears. And though she wasn't free from the past, she had taken the first step toward redemption. But the forest still whispered, and the curse still lingered in the shadows, waiting for the next soul to trespass. The return of the curse. The silence that followed the breaking of the mirror felt unnatural. The group stood frozen, unable to fully comprehend what had just happened. The air was thick with the remnants of the curse, a lingering chill that seemed to wrap itself around their hearts. But as the shards of the shattered mirror lay scattered on the floor, it was clear that something had shifted. Emma, her breath shallow, slowly stepped away from the wreckage of the mirror. Her eyes were wide with shock, and for a moment, she seemed lost in her own mind, as if trying to process everything that had just unfolded. Emma, it's over, right? The curse, it's gone. Jason, who had been watching her closely, shook his head slowly. Jason, I don't think it's that simple. Sophie, her eyes still wide with fear, stepped toward the door, glancing nervously at the window. The oppressive atmosphere had not lifted entirely. The whispers had quieted, but the tension in the air was palpable, as though something else was waiting for them, just out of sight. Sophie, we've seen what it can do. We've seen how it plays with our minds. But what if it's not really gone? What if it's still out there, waiting? Mark walked over to Emma, placing a hand on her shoulder. His voice was calm, but there was an edge of uncertainty in it. Mark, it might not be over yet. But you've faced it. You've faced your own fears, your guilt. And that's more than any of us could have done. We're stronger now. We just need to figure out what to do next. The group looked at one another, each of them grappling with their own fear and uncertainty. They had survived the horrors of the forest, the terrifying images in the mirror, and the whispering curse. But it was clear that whatever had brought them here, whatever force had manipulated them, was not done with them yet. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from outside the cabin, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching on the forest floor. The group jumped in alarm, hearts racing, as the fear that had begun to fade now surged back into them with full force. Sophie, it's back. It's back! Jason, his eyes scanning the darkness outside the cabin, frowned. Jason, it's not just the forest anymore. It's coming for us, again. Mark grabbed a nearby flashlight and shone it toward the window. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees just beyond the cabin. For a moment, everything seemed still, the shadows too thick to reveal anything. But then, from the darkness, something moved. A figure, tall, distorted, and cloaked in shadow. It was walking toward the cabin, its steps slow and deliberate. Mark, we need to get out of here. Now! But before they could react, the door to the cabin slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping them inside. Sophie screamed, backing away from the door as it rattled violently, the wood groaning under the pressure. Sophie, we're locked in. What the hell is happening? Emma, still shaken but determined, rushed to the door, her hands trembling as she tried the handle. It was no use. The door wouldn't budge. They were trapped. Emma, we have to face this. Again, whatever's outside, we need to face it before it gets in here. Jason's voice was calm, though it carried the weight of someone who had already seen too much. Jason, I don't think it's just outside. I think it's already inside. The room seemed to grow colder with every passing second, the shadows stretching and contorting in unnatural ways. The once familiar walls of the cabin now felt alien, as if they had been twisted by some malevolent force. And then the whispers returned. They were faint at first, but quickly grew louder, filling the room with a dissonant chorus. Sophie, what's happening? I can't stand it. Mark gritted his teeth, trying to push back the rising panic. Mark, stay calm. We're not alone in here, but we can't let it control us. Emma, her voice steady despite the chaos around her, spoke up. Emma, we've been running from our fears. From the darkness. But we can't keep running. We have to confront it. All of it. Suddenly, the lights flickered, casting long, twisted shadows across the walls. The whispers grew louder still, like a cacophony of voices clawing at their minds. From the corner of the room, a dark shape began to take form. At first, it was a vague outline, but then it solidified into someone. The figure in the corner was a distorted version of the man they had seen earlier, the one who had warned them about the curse. But this version was wrong. His features were blurred, his face twisted in a grotesque mockery of life. Man, you thought you could escape, didn't you? The voice was chilling, deep and hollow, as though coming from some otherworldly place. Emma, heart racing, stepped forward, her voice trembling but filled with defiance. Emma, what are you? Why are you doing this to us? The figure's eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and he smiled, though the expression was empty and cruel. Man, I am the curse. I am what you fear. And now you must face me, all of you. The shadows around them began to grow, closing in tighter, suffocating the room. The air was thick with malice, and the whispers grew louder, more frantic. Mark, we're not afraid of you. We've already faced what we're running from. We've confronted our fears. The man's smile twisted further, his form flickering like a broken image. Man, you think you've faced your fears? You think you've learned? No, you have just begun to understand. The curse, it lives inside you. It is you. And until you acknowledge that, until you face it completely, it will never let you go. The room seemed to spin, the shadows pressing closer. The figure's words echoed in their minds, filling them with doubt, fear, and regret. But they had no choice. They had to face the curse. Not just the forest, not just the mirror, but everything they had been hiding from. The truth they had been running from was about to come crashing down around them. And this time there would be no escaping it. The final confrontation. The room was suffocating, filled with shadows that seemed to stretch and twist, taking on life of their own. The figure before them, this distorted version of the man who had warned them, seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, a darkness that they couldn't comprehend. As the whispers grew louder, more frantic, each word carrying a weight that pressed down on their souls, the group stood paralyzed. They had survived the horrors of the cursed forest, but this was something else. The very air itself seemed to choke them, like the curse was alive, feeding off their fear. Emma, struggling to steady her breath, took a step forward. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she couldn't back down now. They had come this far. Emma, what do you want from us? Why are you tormenting us? The figure's twisted smile deepened, its eyes glowing brighter as if savoring their fear. His voice, when he spoke, was cold like ice scraping against stone. Man, I want nothing from you. I am your fear. I am your guilt, your shame, your regrets. I am the darkness you've been running from your entire lives. And you can't escape me. The ground beneath their feet seemed to tremble, and the walls of the cabin warped as if the space itself was shifting, distorting into something alien. The whispers seemed to come from everywhere, behind them, within their own minds, even from the very walls themselves. Jason, his eyes wild with panic, grabbed Emma's arm, his voice shaking. Jason, we can't let it win. We can't let it control us. Sophie, still trembling, looked at Emma, her expression torn. Sophie, but how do we fight something like this? How do we defeat something that's inside us? Emma's voice was steady, despite the terror that gripped her heart. She knew they had no choice. They had to face this curse, face the darkness inside of them, or it would consume them all. Emma, we stop running. We face it head on. Everything this thing is a part of us. Our fears, our pain, our guilt, it's all connected. We need to confront it, accept it, and let it go. Mark stepped forward, his eyes filled with determination. He had seen too much, endured too much, to back down now. Mark, we've all been carrying this burden. This darkness that we've been hiding from. But we can't let it define us anymore. We're stronger than it. We have to face the truth, whatever it is. The figure, still smiling its cruel, empty smile, seemed to grow larger, the shadows around them thickening. The temperature in the room dropped further, and for a moment, the group could feel a coldness deep in their bones, as though they were being pulled into the very depths of the curse itself. Man, you think you can defeat me? You are nothing. You have always been nothing. Emma closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. She could feel the darkness pressing in on her, the weight of it threatening to crush her, but she also felt something else. Something powerful, something she had been ignoring for far too long. Her strength. Her resilience. Her will to survive. She opened her eyes, locking her gaze onto the figure. Emma, no. We are not nothing. We are stronger than you'll ever be. We've faced our fears. We've faced the darkest parts of ourselves. And we're still standing. The figure's smile faltered, its form flickering as if it were losing its grip on reality. Mark, you're nothing but a shadow. A reflection of everything we've been afraid to confront. But we're not afraid anymore. The shadows around them seemed to recoil, the oppressive air starting to lift. The whispers, once deafening, grew fainter, less certain. The figure before them began to tremble, its form unstable. Sophie, her voice trembling but filled with newfound resolve, stepped forward. Sophie, we control our own fate. You don't. This curse ends now. The darkness in the room seemed to shrink, retreating from the light of their words, from the strength of their unity. The figure let out a screech, a sound that made their skin crawl. As it began to fade, its form disintegrating into nothingness. As the last of the shadows vanished, the room grew still. The coldness lifted, and the oppressive weight that had been pressing on them finally dissolved. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the air felt lighter. The whispers were gone. The curse was over. But as they stood there, breathing in the newfound silence, they couldn't help but wonder. Was it truly gone? Had they truly defeated the darkness, or had they merely banished it? For now? Emma, her voice soft, spoke the question that lingered in all their minds. Emma, is it really over? Or is there more we don't understand? Jason, Mark, and Sophie exchanged glances, unsure of what to say. They had won, but at what cost? And how much of the curse had they truly confronted? Only time would tell. But for now, they were free. The aftermath. The morning light was a welcome sight, but it felt surreal. They had survived the night, but the horrors they had experienced still weighed heavily on their minds. The forest that once seemed so alive with terror now looked eerily calm, as though nothing had ever happened. The shadows that had haunted them for so long had vanished, but they couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching, lurking in the corners of their minds. Emma sat on the edge of the old cabin's porch, staring out into the now peaceful forest. The breeze had picked up, rustling the leaves, but it didn't seem as threatening anymore. The air was cool, crisp, and oddly refreshing. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the wind wash over her, trying to find some sense of normalcy in the aftermath. Mark walked up behind her, his face grim but calm. Mark, how are you holding up? Emma didn't answer immediately. She was still processing everything they had seen, everything they had done. But despite the lingering fear, there was something else. A sense of relief, maybe even strength. They had faced their darkest fears and come out alive. Emma, I'm okay. I think we're all okay. But what about you? How do you feel? Mark's eyes flickered, as if he was searching for the right words. He had always been the strong one, the protector of the group. But even he had his own demons to face, his own fears that had been exposed by the curse. Mark, I don't know. It's strange, isn't it? We survived. But it feels like something's missing. Like something's still off. Sophie and Jason joined them on the porch, both looking just as unsettled as Mark. The silence between them was thick, full of unspoken words and emotions they weren't ready to confront yet. Sophie, I keep thinking about the things we saw. The way those figures moved. How they seemed so alive even though they weren't. Jason, I keep hearing the whispers. Every time I close my eyes, I can hear them. The voice in the wind, it's still with me. Emma, it's not over, is it? The curse, it's not really gone. Jason's eyes widened, as if the thought had just occurred to him. Jason, you think it's still here? With us? Emma nodded, her gaze distant as she looked out into the woods. Her heart raced just thinking about it. They had defeated the figure in the cabin, but something felt incomplete. They had faced the fear, the darkness, but had they truly destroyed it, or had they only scratched the surface? Emma, I don't know. But I feel like it's still watching us. Like it's still waiting. Sophie shuddered. Sophie, I don't want to stay here any longer. It feels wrong. Mark stood up, his expression hardening with resolve. Mark, we can't keep running from it. Whatever it is, we need to face it head on. We need to go back to the source. Jason, the source? What do you mean? Mark turned to face them all, his voice firm, filled with a newfound determination. Mark, the forest. We need to go back to where it all started. We need to find out why this curse exists and put an end to it once and for all. Emma's heart raced. The idea of going back to the forest, to the place that had almost consumed them, filled her with dread. But deep down, she knew they couldn't just leave. Not until they understood what had happened. Emma, I don't know if I'm ready for that. But if it's the only way to stop this, then we'll do it. The group exchanged uneasy glances. They had been through hell already, but the thought of returning to the forest, to face whatever still lurked there, was terrifying. But they knew they had no choice. Mark, we have to end this. It's the only way we can truly be free. And so, with a collective sense of dread and determination, they packed up their things and began the long drive back to the cursed forest. The journey was silent, each of them lost in their own thoughts, their own fears. No one spoke of what they had seen. No one mentioned the figure in the cabin or the whispers that still haunted them. They were all too afraid to voice the fear that was growing in the pit of their stomachs. The further they drove, the more oppressive the air became. It was as if the forest was calling them, pulling them back into its dark embrace. The trees stood like silent sentinels, watching them as they approached. When they finally reached the edge of the forest, it felt like they were standing on the threshold of something much larger than themselves. The air was thick with tension, and the forest seemed to pulse with an eerie energy. Emma took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. This was it, the moment they had been dreading. They had no choice now but to walk into the heart of the darkness. They stepped out of the car, the ground beneath their feet soft and uneven. The trees loomed over them, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The whispering wind brushed against their skin, carrying with it the faintest hint of the voice they had heard before. Voice in the wind. You cannot escape. It was the same voice. The same curse. It was alive, and it was waiting for them. Sophie, I don't know if I can do this. Emma placed a hand on Sophie's shoulder, offering her the only comfort she could. They had come this far. They had to finish this. Together. Emma, we're in this together. Let's end it. With that, they took their first steps into the forest, the shadows closing in around them. The final confrontation was upon them, and this time, they were determined to face it head-on. The aftermath. The morning light was a welcome sight, but it felt surreal. They had survived the night, but the horrors they had experienced still weighed heavily on their minds. The forest that once seemed so alive with terror now looked eerily calm, as though nothing had ever happened. The shadows that had haunted them for so long had vanished, but they couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching, lurking in the corners of their minds. Emma sat on the edge of the old cabin's porch, staring out into the now peaceful forest. The breeze had picked up, rustling the leaves, but it didn't seem as threatening anymore. The air was cool, crisp, and oddly refreshing. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the wind wash over her, trying to find some sense of normalcy in the aftermath. Mark walked up behind her, his face grim but calm. Mark, how are you holding up? Emma didn't answer immediately. She was still processing everything they had seen, everything they had done. But despite the lingering fear, there was something else. A sense of relief, maybe even strength. They had faced their darkest fears and come out alive. Emma, I'm okay. I think we're all okay. But what about you? How do you feel? Mark's eyes flickered, as if he was searching for the right words. He had always been the strong one, the protector of the group. But even he had his own demons to face, his own fears that had been exposed by the curse. Mark, I don't know. It's strange, isn't it? We survived. But it feels like something's missing. Like something's still off. Sophie and Jason joined them on the porch, both looking just as unsettled as Mark. The silence between them was thick, full of unspoken words and emotions they weren't ready to confront yet. Sophie, I keep thinking about the things we saw. The way those figures moved. How they seemed so alive even though they weren't. Jason, I keep hearing the whispers. Every time I close my eyes, I can hear them. The voice in the wind, it's still with me. Emma, it's not over, is it? The curse, it's not really gone. Jason's eyes widened, as if the thought had just occurred to him. Jason, you think it's still here? With us? Emma nodded, her gaze distant as she looked out into the woods. Her heart raced just thinking about it. They had defeated the figure in the cabin, but something felt incomplete. They had faced the fear, the darkness, but had they truly destroyed it, or had they only scratched the surface? Emma, I don't know, but I feel like it's still watching us. Like it's still waiting. Sophie shuddered. Sophie, I don't want to stay here any longer. It feels wrong. Mark stood up, his expression hardening with resolve. Mark, we can't keep running from it. Whatever it is, we need to face it head on. We need to go back to the source. Jason, the source? What do you mean? Mark turned to face them all, his voice firm, filled with a newfound determination. Mark, the forest. We need to go back to where it all started. We need to find out why this curse exists and put an end to it once and for all. Emma's heart raced. The idea of going back to the forest, to the place that had almost consumed them, filled her with dread. But deep down, she knew they couldn't just leave. Not until they understood what had happened. Emma, I don't know if I'm ready for that. But if it's the only way to stop this, then we'll do it. The group exchanged uneasy glances. They had been through hell already, but the thought of returning to the forest, to face whatever still lurked there, was terrifying. But they knew they had no choice. Mark, we have to end this. It's the only way we can truly be free. And so, with a collective sense of dread and determination, they packed up their things and began the long drive back to the cursed forest. The journey was silent, each of them lost in their own thoughts, their own fears. No one spoke of what they had seen, no one mentioned the figure in the cabin or the whispers that still haunted them. They were all too afraid to voice the fear that was growing in the pit of their stomachs. The further they drove, the more oppressive the air became. It was as if the forest was calling them, pulling them back into its dark embrace. The trees stood like silent sentinels, watching them as they approached. When they finally reached the edge of the forest, it felt like they were standing on the threshold of something much larger than themselves. The air was thick with tension, and the forest seemed to pulse with an eerie energy. Emma took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. This was it, the moment they had been dreading. They had no choice now but to walk into the heart of the darkness. They stepped out of the car, the ground beneath their feet soft and uneven. The trees loomed over them, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The whispering wind brushed against their skin, carrying with it the faintest hint of the voice they had heard before. Voice in the wind. You cannot escape. It was the same voice. The same curse. It was alive, and it was waiting for them. Sophie, I don't know if I can do this. Emma placed a hand on Sophie's shoulder, offering her the only comfort she could. They had come this far. They had to finish this. Together. Emma, we're in this together. Let's end it. With that, they took their first steps into the forest, the shadows closing in around them. The final confrontation was upon them, and this time, they were determined to face it head-on. The dark heart of the forest. The forest was silent, its oppressive darkness closing in around them as they ventured deeper. The trees loomed overhead, their twisted branches forming a canopy that blocked out most of the moonlight. It was as though the forest itself was alive, watching them, waiting for them to make a mistake. The air grew colder with each step they took, the shadows growing thicker, more foreboding. The feeling of being followed, of something just beyond their sight, was almost unbearable. Sophie's voice broke the silence, a tremor of fear lacing her words. Sophie, I don't like this. It feels wrong. Like we're walking into a trap. Jason, who had been unusually quiet, nodded in agreement. Jason, it's not just you. I feel it too. It's like the forest knows we're here. Mark, who had been walking ahead, his eyes narrowed and focused, suddenly stopped. Mark, we're close. Emma looked ahead, trying to pierce through the dark, but the trees and shadows made it impossible to see much. Her heart raced as she tried to steady her breathing. Emma, close to what? Mark, what are you talking about? Mark turned back to face them, his expression grim. There was something in his eyes that they hadn't seen before, a quiet resolve, mixed with the same fear that they all shared. Mark, the source. The heart of the curse. I can feel it. It's just ahead. They continued walking, but the path grew more treacherous. The ground beneath their feet was uneven, with roots twisting like veins, threatening to trip them at every step. The whispers from earlier had returned, but now they seemed louder, more insistent, surrounding them. It wasn't just the wind anymore. It was as if the trees themselves were speaking to them. Voice in the wind. You cannot escape. You will never leave. Emma's breath caught in her throat as the words echoed in her mind. She wasn't sure if it was the forest itself or something else, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being drawn deeper into its heart. The air grew colder still, the temperature dropping rapidly as they walked. Suddenly, the path before them opened up, revealing a small clearing in the middle of the forest. The trees surrounding it were unnaturally still, and in the center of the clearing stood an ancient stone altar, its surface covered in dark, twisted symbols. The altar was old, weathered by centuries of decay, but there was something about it, something that felt wrong. As though it had been waiting for them all along. Sophie gasped, her hand covering her mouth in horror. Sophie, what is this place? What happened here? Emma stepped forward, her eyes locked on the altar, unable to look away. There was something drawing her in, something that she couldn't explain. She felt as though she had been here before, in some distant memory that she couldn't quite grasp. Jason. This is where it all began. This is where the curse started. The wind howled through the clearing, its eerie voice sending chills down their spines. Voice in the wind. It was never meant to end. You were never meant to come back. Mark stepped forward, his face hardening with determination. He seemed to know what they had to do, even if they didn't. Mark, we have to destroy it. We have to destroy the altar. Emma looked at him, her heart racing. Destroy the altar? Was it even possible? The curse had felt so powerful, so alive. Could they really put an end to it? Sophie, how? How do we destroy it? Mark looked around, his eyes scanning the clearing. Then, with a sense of finality, he reached into his bag and pulled out an old, weathered book. It was bound in black leather, and the pages inside seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. Mark, this book. It's the key. It's the only way to end this. Jason, where did you get that? Mark, it doesn't matter. What matters is that it holds the answer. The ritual to destroy the curse. Without saying another word, Mark began flipping through the pages of the book, his fingers trembling slightly as he searched for the right one. The others stood there, watching him with a mixture of hope and fear. Could this really be the answer? Could they end the nightmare once and for all? Finally, Mark stopped on a page. He looked up at them, his face pale but resolute. Mark, it's here. We have to perform the ritual. We have to speak the incantation and destroy the altar. But it won't be easy. The forest will fight back. Emma swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the decision settle on her shoulders. They had come this far. They couldn't turn back now. Emma, let's do it. Whatever it takes. As Mark began to chant the incantation from the book, the wind began to pick up again, howling louder and louder. The trees seemed to bend and twist, as if they were alive, reacting to the words Mark spoke. The shadows in the clearing grew darker, more oppressive, and Emma could feel the weight of something ancient and powerful pressing down on them. Suddenly, the altar began to glow, its dark symbols lighting up with an eerie, unnatural light. The ground beneath their feet trembled, and the air grew thick with an energy that felt both alien and familiar. Voice in the wind. You cannot destroy us. We are the darkness that binds you. The trees around them began to creak and groan, as if they were coming to life. The shadows shifted, taking on shapes and forms, moving closer and closer. But they couldn't stop now. They had to finish the ritual. As Mark continued the chant, the ground trembled harder, and a massive shape emerged from the darkness. A shadowy figure, larger than any they had seen before. Its eyes burned with a fiery glow, its form shifting and writhing, as if it was made of the darkness itself. Sophie screamed. Sophie, it's here. It's coming. Mark, stay focused. We have to finish this. With a final word from the incantation, the altar cracked, its surface breaking apart, the dark symbols fading. The shadowy figure let out a deafening scream, and the ground beneath them shattered, sending them all sprawling to the ground. The clearing was silent. The forest had fallen quiet, the wind no longer howling. The figure was gone. The altar was destroyed. The curse was broken. But as they lay there, battered and exhausted, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. The shadows, though gone, still lingered at the edges of her vision. She couldn't help but wonder, had they truly destroyed it? Or had they only delayed the inevitable? The last whisper. The silence that followed the destruction of the altar was suffocating. The oppressive air that had once surrounded the group now felt strangely hollow, as though the forest itself had been exhaling a sigh of relief. But Emma, still lying on the cold ground, couldn't shake the uneasy feeling gnawing at her insides. The curse had been broken, or so they thought. Sophie, her face pale with shock, slowly stood up, her hands trembling as she brushed dirt and leaves from her clothes. "Sophie, it's over, right? We've done it." Jason, who had been staring at the shattered altar, stood silently, his eyes wide with disbelief. It seemed as though he couldn't believe what had just happened, and Emma shared his confusion. "Jason, it should be. But something doesn't feel right. I can't explain it." Mark stood tall, the book still clutched tightly in his hand. His face was unreadable as he scanned the clearing, as if searching for something they couldn't see. He said nothing for a long moment, and just when Emma was about to ask what was wrong, he spoke. "Mark, the curse, it's not over. Not completely." Emma's heart sank. She wanted to believe they had finally freed themselves from the terror, but the weight in her chest told her otherwise. "Emma, what do you mean?" "The altar is destroyed. The incantation was finished. The forest should be free." Mark turned to face her, his expression grave. "Mark, the curse isn't bound to the altar. It's tied to something much older, something deeper. We may have broken the surface, but the core of it, it's still here." Suddenly, a low rumbling noise echoed through the clearing. The ground trembled beneath them, and the trees seemed to sway in an unnatural rhythm, as though something deep within the earth was stirring. "Jason, this isn't over, is it?" Mark shook his head, his eyes scanning the trees warily. "Mark, no, it's not. The forest was never just a place. It's alive, connected to the curse. We've only angered it." Before anyone could respond, the air seemed to grow thick with dread. A dark figure emerged from the shadows, its form indistinct, like a cloud of smoke taking shape. It moved with unnatural speed, swirling around the group, causing the air to grow colder with each passing second. Sophie gasped, her voice barely a whisper. "Sophie, what is that?" The figure seemed to ripple, changing shape with every heartbeat. It was like the very darkness of the forest had taken form, its edges jagged, like the outline of something monstrous. Emma felt a cold sweat break out on her skin as it moved closer, its presence oppressive. "Mark, it's the heart of the curse. The thing that feeds off the fear, the pain. The ritual may have disrupted the altar, but it's still here, feeding on us. We have to stop it." Emma felt the weight of Mark's words settle on her shoulders. How could they stop something like this? They had already done everything they could, and yet this darkness, this entity, still existed. The figure whispered, its voice a rasping, guttural sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Voice of darkness. You cannot escape what you are. You are part of me now. You always have been." The words seemed to slice through the air, and the temperature dropped even further. Emma could feel the ground beneath her feet begin to crack, the earth splitting open as if responding to the presence of the dark figure. "Mark, we have to confront it. Head on. If we don't, it will consume us all." "Sophie, but how? What do we do?" Mark raised the book, the faint glow from its pages casting an eerie light on his face. The words he spoke were ancient, filled with power. The air around them seemed to vibrate with the force of his chant, and for a moment, Emma felt like the world itself was trembling in response. Suddenly, the dark figure let out a deafening scream. It was a sound of pure fury, one that rattled the trees and made the very earth beneath them shake. It lunged at them, its tendrils reaching out like claws, pulling the darkness around them tighter. "Jason, it's too strong. We can't fight it." Mark's voice was calm, despite the chaos unfolding around them. "Mark, we don't need to fight it. We need to face it." With those words, Mark held the book high above his head. The energy from the book seemed to pulse with increasing intensity, the pages glowing brighter. The wind picked up, swirling around them, tugging at their clothes, but Emma's gaze was locked on the dark figure. She could see it clearly now, its true form emerging from the shadows. It was not just darkness. It was fear. It was every horror, every terror they had ever felt, manifested into one creature. It was everything that haunted them, everything they feared most. Emma closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. When she opened them again, she understood. The answer was not to fight it, not to destroy it. It had fed off fear for centuries. To truly break the curse, they had to strip it of its power, by no longer fearing it. "Emma, we have to face our own fears. All of us." The others looked at her, confusion and fear in their eyes. "Emma, we've been running from it, from the terror it creates. But it can only control us if we let it. We need to face it, without fear." Mark nodded, his voice steady despite the chaos. Mark, she's right. We have to stop running. With that, they all turned to face the dark figure, standing firm, no longer backing down. Emma felt her fear begin to fade, replaced by a strange calm. As she stared into the creature's glowing eyes, she understood something. It wasn't the creature they needed to defeat. It was their own terror, the fear they had carried for so long. Sophie, trembling, spoke softly. Sophie, I'm not afraid anymore. We're not afraid. Jason, we are stronger than this thing. And as they all stood together, the dark figure began to shrink. Its form distorted, as if the very essence of their defiance was draining its power. The shadows that had once been so oppressive began to break apart, fading into the night. The wind died down. The trees stopped swaying. The curse was over. The forest fell silent, no longer alive with terror. But even as the darkness disappeared, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed within her. Something deep, something she couldn't quite explain. The battle was over, but the journey, her journey, was only just beginning. The final echo. The forest was still. The terrifying entity that had haunted them was gone, reduced to nothing but fading whispers in the air. But as Emma, Mark, Sophie, and Jason stood in the eerie silence, a heavy weight hung in the air. It wasn't fear anymore, but a strange emptiness, as though the life that had once filled the forest had been sucked away, leaving behind nothing but a hollow shell. Mark closed the book, the glow from its pages fading as the words of the incantation slowly died out. He exhaled, his shoulders slumping as if a great burden had been lifted. But his expression remained solemn. Mark, it's over, or at least it should be. Emma glanced around, her heart still racing from the encounter with the dark entity. The air felt different now, colder, heavier, but the oppressive sense of dread was gone. Still, there was something about the way the trees stood, so still, so silent, that made her uneasy. Jason, so what now? Sophie's voice trembled as she spoke, her eyes scanning the clearing around them. Sophie, we've survived. We've beaten it. We're free, right? Mark didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stared into the distance, as if looking for something that wasn't there. Mark, I don't know. The curse may have been lifted, but it doesn't feel like it's completely over. There's still something in the air, something we're missing. Emma felt a knot form in her stomach. They had faced the darkness, fought through it, and somehow emerged on the other side. But Mark's words left her with a lingering sense of doubt. Emma, what do you mean? The entity is gone. We destroyed the altar. The curse should be broken. Mark turned to face her, his eyes filled with a mixture of exhaustion and caution. Mark, the curse was never just about the altar or the entity. It was never just about the forest. It's about all of us. Our fears, our guilt, our darkest secrets. This place, it didn't just trap us physically. It trapped us emotionally, too. We've been fighting it for so long, but we never really understood what it was until now. Jason stepped forward, his brow furrowed in confusion. Jason, so what now? We leave. It's over, right? Mark hesitated before nodding. Mark, yes for now. But the curse was never just about fighting monsters or breaking altars. It was about confronting ourselves. We've only scratched the surface of what we truly fear. And that's the hardest battle of all. Sophie, still shaken by the events, looked down at her feet. The realization that the true battle might be within themselves hit her like a cold wave. Sophie, are you saying we have to face more of this? More fear? Mark gave a tired smile, but there was no joy in it, only a weary understanding. Mark, no one can truly escape the past without facing it. The curse may be over, but its effects will linger. It will follow us. We have to confront what lies within us, or we'll never be free. Emma felt the weight of those words settle into her chest. The forest around them was still, but the world inside her felt unsettled, restless. She wasn't sure what Mark meant exactly, but she knew one thing. This journey was far from over. Jason, I don't know if I can face anything more. This place nearly broke me. Mark, you don't have to do it alone. We all face our demons together. That's the only way. Sophie looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and determination. Sophie, so what now? Mark, we leave. But we don't forget what we learned here. We take the lessons with us. And if the curse truly is over, then maybe, just maybe, we can start to heal. The group stood in silence for a moment, taking in the enormity of the situation. Emma couldn't help but wonder what the future held. The forest, the curse, the dark entity, they were behind them now. But the true test, the one Mark had spoken of, was ahead. As they turned to leave, Emma caught one last glimpse of the clearing. The trees, now silent and unmoving, seemed to hold their breath, as if waiting for something. And for a moment, she thought she heard it, the faintest whisper carried on the wind. It was almost as if the forest itself was saying goodbye. But was it truly the end? Or was there something else lingering in the shadows? The end of the haunted forest.